dad graduated 9th in a high school class of 9. True story. Born and raised on a dairy farm, literally born on the farm, not in a hospital. Second oldest of 11 kids, and to escape that madness and mayhem, you remember back in the day, see the world, join the Navy. So he hitchhiked from Central Texas to San Diego, did his basic training, did his job training, was assigned to a destroyer, a submarine hunter, as part of an aircraft carrier escort task force. And they set off from Long Beach, California to Vietnam, more specifically the South China Sea, the naval blockade, to keep people from bringing more resources that could come against America in that war that was brewing. Now here's a guy that had barely been out of his own county in his entire life. And the times that I remember him reminiscing about his time in the Navy, there's one story that I cannot tell in mixed company. But beyond that, to hear him talk about the ocean and the vastness of it and how infinite it seemed in every direction, it just seemed like it went on and on and on. And he said there was some magnificence there was some fear there when you saw the waves that were, bigger than a Mack truck. He also said there was this feeling that you were never going anywhere. Even though you knew you were, day after day, the scenery is the same. And until you see land, it may seem like you're not really going anywhere. But you really are. The mental health issue is kind of like that ocean. Seemingly infinite. Seemingly that it goes on forever. It is the elephant that's in the room that nobody wants to talk about, but it's not an insurmountable problem. It's not something that we can't make progress in. In fact, we can make and have made significant strides in the field of mental health. And that's part of what today is, the sequential intercept mapping. That, by the way, the map is actually on your agenda. It took me a minute to actually figure it out, for it to click. I'm not the brightest bulb on the tree all the time. So I had to kind of study it, have it explained to me 3 or 4 times, backwards and forwards, and now I get it. It's a chance to identify people in the mental health system, the process, and it helps a community identify the obstacles that keep people from moving on to the next level. So it's a really cool program, and I appreciate you all being here today and your buy-in to the overall idea. Before we get started, show of hands, law enforcement. So that's about a fourth of the room. I imagine they talk a lot about empathy at the police academy, right? That's probably an everyday conversation in the police academy, you think? Well, this is me. And this is this. This is what my invitation is to you today. Is to buy into the idea of empathy. The art of stepping imaginatively into the shoes of another person. And trying to understand what the people on the other side of the aisle are doing. Obviously, there's a huge overlap in what we're interested in, but our processes are vastly different. And even those of us that are in the mental health caring professions, our processes are vastly different from each other. So, imaginatively stepping, especially for you law enforcement, across the aisle, and then those of us that aren't across the aisle, to understand sometimes there are constraints, sometimes there's rules and regulations, sometimes there's processes in place that are going to take, it's like turning the Titanic. It takes a while to get some things changed. So what you want to do is try to understand another person's feelings and their perspective, and you use that understanding to guide your actions. Sympathy is a good thing. Sympathy is when you feel sorry for somebody. Empathy is when you feel with somebody. So you're trying to put yourself in their shoes. How do they feel? What do they think? You're not always going to get it perfect, but if you try and grow today, here's what might happen. You might grow a couple of IQ points, maybe, especially with Keisha's presentation. You might actually, there's also this thing called emotional intelligence. They call it EQ. And my invitation for you today is to pay attention to that as well. And hopefully you'll take away a few EQ points that will help you on your journey to be better at what it is that you do. Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, right? We want to leave this place better than the way we found it, right? We want to leave, we may not be thinking in terms of legacy, but that's what we're leaving. We're leaving our children and our grandchildren a better place to live, a better life in the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? We all want that, but we do go about it in vastly different ways. So I hope you're on board for the day because we have 4 other phenomenal speakers. Keisha and I, after her presentation, are going to do just a quick question and answer period. Then we'll break for lunch, and then we'll come back and have the 3 speakers, and then they'll do a little kind of like a mini town hall where you guys can ask them questions as well, all right? So as things come up, write your questions down or kind of put a pin in it and hold it in your head. In the meantime, I want to give you a 20,000-foot view of the mental health issue. I want to look down on the ocean. I want to look down on the elephant that's in the room. And by the way, what's the answer to the question, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And we just can all keep taking bites, right? That's all we can do. And today's a big chunk. Today's a big cumulative bite out of that proverbial elephant that is the mental health epidemic, pandemic, whatever you want to call it. Now, the last thing I want you to hear me say at the very beginning is that in any way, form, or fashion that cancer is a good thing. Cancer's bad. We all wish we could get rid of it. I wish they would raise another $1 billion to get rid of cancer. But I'm going to compare the number of new cancer diagnoses with the number of new mental health diagnoses in a year. In the country, 1.8 million people, which is the size of San Antonio, will get the bad news. You have cancer. We've all had people in our family. You yourself may have or may be a survivor of cancer. But that's a lot of folks, isn't it? If you put it in terms of San Antonio, that's a lot of folks. Well, let's look at it compared to mental health conditions. 29 million is where we start. That's the entire state of Texas. And then the entire state of New York, that's another 19 million people. This is the number of new mental health illness diagnoses that we will have in this calendar year. Now, I'm married to a math teacher, but I'm not very good at math. So it's 20, 30, 48, right? Ah, there it is right there. But then you add in the kids. There's 7.7 million children suffering from illnesses that they know nothing about, that they had nothing, they didn't deserve it, they didn't earn it, they don't know what to do with it. Their parents, quite frankly, many of them don't know what to do as well, which is part of our ongoing challenge, right? It's community education. But that leaves us with 55.7 million people in this country of ours, this great land, that suffer from a mental health crisis every year. How does that compare to 1.8? There's no comparison, is there? There's really no, you can't even begin to 55.7 to 1.8. So it breaks down to about 1 in 5 or 1 in 6. So you look across the room, we've got how many, 100 and something people in here? So I'm not going to even try to do the math. I'll embarrass my wife if I try to do that. But 1 in 5 or 1 in 6, so it's at least 20 or 18. So my personal journey included the real interesting thing that happened to me when I was 21 years old. I was newly married. I'd never been away from my wife yet. And I played on a very highly competitive men's open softball team. Basically, we were the guys that either had been or weren't good enough to make the baseball team. We were young and we were talented, and we were sponsored by the Baptist Student Union, right? So we viewed it as kind of a ministry. And we got this guy from the Catholic Center and this guy from the Methodist Center. We were like an all-star team of guys that would travel and go to these big beer league tournaments and win. And we were called the Young Guns, as the movie that was popular at the time. We went to Austin for a tournament. And again, first time away from my wife. When I got there, everybody was putting their bags in, kind of hanging out, watching some TV, and then they headed out to get something to eat. I had two bags. I had my bat bag, right? I had the bats and the gloves and the balls and all the softball kit, and then I have my duffel bag with my street clothes, right? You with me? I knelt down, and I can still see myself doing it. Unpacked and repacked. All right, not a big deal in and of itself, except I unpacked and repacked and unpacked and repacked and unpacked and repacked. I was fully aware of what I was doing, saying to myself, this is weird, as I was doing it, not being able to stop myself. So imagine how somebody is with schizophrenia or with OCD on a scale. Mine is like a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. Imagine somebody who has it on a scale of 8, 9, or 10. I was the chaplain at Terrell State Psychiatric Hospital for a while. And there were people that if you left this clicker on the table, they would pick it up and try to swallow it because they cannot help themselves from doing it. Sounds weird? Sure. But that is what it is. Each mental illness carries with it its own symptoms, its own severity, etc., etc. And so that obviously is what would later become an official diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder. At the time, in the 80s, it was still listed under an anxiety disorder, but it's gotten so popular and prevalent that it's kind of popped out and it's its own thing. And it comes in at number 7 on the big board, on the top 10. Now, some mental illnesses skew male, some skew female. But at the end of the day, it's about 50-50. It breaks down male and female about 50-50. Racially, it's very, very interesting that you see Asian, Black, and Hispanic at 14, 17, and 18% of the culture reporting a mental illness. If you know anything about sociology and you know that the Asian cultures, many of them are shame-based cultures, right? They do not want anybody to know that anybody has anything going on with them. Now, which I think is why I put chronic underreporting. And then the Black and Hispanic communities are about the same, but I also think for various reasons there's underreporting in the Black and brown communities as well. I think, you see where it goes to white, and then we'll talk about these other two. I think it's going to wind up, and I'm not a statistician or an expert, but I think it's going to wind up being about 20%. The aggregate is going to be about 20%. That's 1 in 5. It's amazing how that math works. Now, mixed and LGBTQ, 44%. Hey, this is the world we live in now. You officers, I know you serve and protect everybody in your community, even a trans person, even a gay person. You're going to do it because it's your job. But just realize that they have a 44%, because they already have some self-image issues. There's some things that some of them aren't quite confident in, and people just trash them all the time, right? The trans people, the LGBTQ community, especially in conservative areas like East Texas. So we have to be aware that we don't trigger unnecessarily somebody to have a mental health episode from that community if we can at all help it. Now, who knows what the DSM is? I'm sure there's many of you, most of you do. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. In paperback, it's about this thick. It costs about $40, and it is fascinating reading, right? If you want to fall asleep really fast, it will get you there. It's basically the psychiatrist's Bible or the psychiatry go-to book. It is the book or the document that explains or defines what the different mental illnesses are. Clinical depression is this symptom, this symptom, this symptom, for this long a period of time at this severity. Does that make sense? And so each one has its own 5 symptoms. If you have 3 of those 5 for a period of 2 weeks, then you have this. Okay, so that's where you get your official diagnoses from, and that's where the psychiatrists and medical doctors are getting their diagnoses for you and for your loved ones and your patients and your citizens. That's where they're getting those official diagnoses. By far and away, number 1 on the big board is anxiety. And there's 20 different types of anxiety that I could do a whole hour on anxiety. So I encourage you to study up on it, because it can take many forms. And you know, for you law enforcement officers, here's a learning opportunity for us non-law enforcement people. The training in mental health is getting better for law enforcement officers, the CIT classes, the mental health peace officer classes, and so on. But it still doesn't rival what they get in terms of the drug and the alcohol awareness and how to spot if somebody's on this or on that as far as drugs and alcohol, right? But many mental illnesses and many of the anxieties mask, or look like, I should say, a substance misuse disorder. So it's very difficult, and these officers and deputies only have sometimes seconds. If they have the luxury of minutes, then that is truly a luxury in the field when you're dealing with somebody who has possibly a mental health issue. So they have to decide right now, is this person high or on drugs, or are they drunk? If so, with what? Okay, y'all are really good at that. Do they have a mental illness? If so, then with what? There's only 100 different things that they have to think about. Well, hopefully today I'll just kind of narrow it down to the top 10 and give you some food for thought. I'm definitely not. I brought a psychiatrist one time in this very room to a CIT class, and they basically booed me off the stage, and he got like 3 encores. Okay, because the officers could not believe, here's a psychiatrist who was the admitting psychiatrist at Terrell, was here talking about how to quickly assess what somebody may be going through up here. Fascinating. Fascinating to have somebody like that come talk to us. And Dr. Schnell later on will give us a little glimpse of that as he talks about mental health in the emergency room. But anxiety has its own, category. 40 million people suffer from anxiety. That's the entire state of California. Can you tell he likes geography? That'll be a running theme throughout the rest of my presentation. And this is one that skews female. Women are twice as likely to be diagnosed with anxiety than men are. There are at least 10 types. Second is behavioral disorders in children. And you've heard, like on their old school radio, number 1 with a bullet. This one a few years ago wasn't even in the top 10. And it just continues to get worse. And I don't think it's a problem that's getting worse. I think it's an understanding and a reporting of the problems that children are having. And keep in mind, a mental illness is a hereditary thing where you get some bad brain chemistry, and it's not anything that's anybody's fault. And kids certainly have no idea what's going on in their own selves most of the time. So behavioral disorders in children, you begin with ADHD. That's the most common cause of discipline in preteens. Almost 1 in 10 preteens has ADHD. Boys, this one skews male. Boys are 3 times more likely to have ADHD than girls. That's why you see those elementary and junior high boys in the principal's office, right? You see them down there, and they're in the principal's office, 5 times a month. They've got a pass. Just go straight to the principal's office. Now, I'm married to a school teacher, so this next thing is just one of my biases. And by the way, we all have blind spots and we all have biases. Okay? And if you say you don't, that's your first blind spot. Okay? I'm married to a school teacher for 1 billion years. And so school teachers often take the brunt of these children that come in because only 1 in 7 are actually medicated. And believe me, I understand. But that is the stat, and that is a heartbreaker for school teachers. Here's a little bit more on that. Teenage girls are more likely to have inward-directed symptoms, whereas boys are more likely to act out. Adolescent girls have a higher prevalence of depression. And number 9 on the big board, eating disorders. They have depression, eating disorders, and suicidal ideations and actual attempts more than boys. However, adolescent boys are more likely to have anger issues, engage in dangerous behavior, and actually commit death by suicide at a much higher rate than the girls are. Number 3 is depression. 17.1 million people across this great land of ours suffer one form or another of depression. Now, who wakes up in the morning and says, you know, I think I want to be clinically depressed today. I think I want to be so depressed that I want it to debilitate me and cause me to not be able to work, not be able to have a good relationship, not be able to do the things that I want to do in my life. Nobody asks for that. Now, we all have our blue days where we're a little depressed. Absolutely we do. But somebody who's been diagnosed with clinical depression, if you've been there, you know it ain't nothing that nobody wants. And that's maybe the most misunderstood and maligned of the mental illnesses. Why don't you snap out of it? We're a big pull yourself up by your bootstraps culture, aren't we, historically in Texas? So that's just, you know, that's not going to work when we're dealing with official diagnoses, okay? You can't spank ADHD out of a kid, all right? You can't bootstrap yourself out of clinical depression. And by the way, 17.1 million is the size of Houston times 17 and a half, or 7 and a half. 7.5 times the city of Houston. That's how many people in this country will have depression. And then good old bipolar disorder. 8.9 people. The average onset for men is 22, for women it's 27. And bipolar 1 and 2 have ups and downs of mania, or we call it manic. And they also feature depression, but the difference is 1 also features psychosis, which is more associated with a kind of a break in reality, right? So that's how they tell the difference between 1 and 2. 2 features hypomania, such as inflated self-image, flights of idea, risky spending, and high sex drive. And that's one that kind of mirrors like cocaine, for example. That high sex drive. Somebody might be, you know, making bad choices sexually, but it's not a drug, it's just a mental illness that's gone askew, and as they spin the wheel of misfortune, oh, I just made that up. Somebody write that down and tell me later. Wheel of misfortune. And it just lands on high sex drive, bipolar. No fault of their own. Now, 5 is a little harder to understand. Dissociation. Not disassociation, as I used to call it, but dissociation. Think borderline personality disorder, right? And this skews very much female, 75%. Those of you of a certain age will remember the movie Fatal Attraction, right? Glenn Close, what's his name? Michael Douglas. You know, if I can't have you, nobody can have you. That's where you get your female family annihilators from. You know, there aren't many, but when they do, inevitably, they'll come back as borderline personality disorder. And it comes from not having good relationships and good trusting male role models when you're young, which leads to not having good trusting male role models when you're older and you make bad choices and you choose the risky guys and the guys that are more tend to use you and abuse you. And then because you have this dormant pool of lava inside of you called borderline personality disorder, you lash out violently to them. Does that make sense? Let's see what else is on the big board. Hey, PTSD. That's fun. I understand we might say, we might even go to a bad movie and go, oh God, I have a little PTSD from that. That's horrible. We will say that in passing, and that's fine, as long as we understand that we don't really, right? We might be shocked a little bit. We might be mildly traumatized, but we don't have PTSD until the doctor says you have PTSD. And it's not exclusive to law enforcement. Sexual assault victims will quite often come down with PTSD. And by the way, this is really the cool part of it, and this is no jest. You see where DSM-5-TR 2022? It's a transcript revision. And so finally, last year, they made a transcript revision to DSM-5, and it includes a lot more than PTSD. But they popped, PTSD used to be considered an anxiety disorder. And that was almost a slap in the face to the sexual assault survivors and the combat veterans and the first responders who suffer from PTSD. It's not an anxiety-based disorder. It's a trauma and stressor-related disorder. And there's also a correlation to substance abuse because you're just trying to self-medicate. You're just trying to get through the day, right? You're just trying to get by. It's not exclusive to combat vets. In fact, sexual assault victims are twice as likely to have PTSD than your combat vets. Then we get to something else that's a relatively new addition to, I think it was about 12, 15 years ago, that substance and addiction-based disorders or misuse were popped out and added into the family of mental illnesses. Added into that genre. Because again, who wakes up? Who wakes up and says, you know, I want to be an alcoholic today. I want to be a cokehead or a heroin addict. That's what my job is today, is to do that. Who wants that? Now, I used to have a bias that I'll admit. I don't have it anymore. But I used to have a bias towards people who drank too much and people who used drugs, because that was a bad choice. And I never did that. I wasn't a choir boy. But I never used coke or heroin. So it's a bad choice. But still, millions of people use illegal drugs and don't become addicted to them. Why? Why this person and not the rest of these people? Because they have a brain chemistry that, again, the wheel of misfortune just spins and it lands right on. You use cocaine or heroin one time. You take, go on one bar crawl in college and you're an alcoholic. Right? It's just the brain chemistry gone awry. Most people with addiction and substance abuse struggle with co-occurring illnesses, so they self-medicate. Oh, it's in 2011, so it's been 13 years? The AMA, American Medical Association, began defining addiction as a chronic brain disorder. Okay? And what was number 7? Who remembers 7? You with a cookie. Okay? The girl with the mushroom shirt on. I think I had that shirt. That's my shirt. Number 10. So what was number 9?
Eating disorders.
You don't want a cookie. Can we edit that out in post? Is that too much? So schizophrenia, which I like to call the big sexy. The big sexy. It barely makes the top 10. Barely. With 3.5 million people, bottom line. San Antonio, Dallas, and Fort Worth combined. But it does make for good theater, doesn't it? I watch all those movies and I watch all those American Horror Story. I'm all in. for a good horse and a good schizophrenia character, because the voices can make you do anything. Right? So it is cool entertainment. But if you really ever encountered somebody that has schizophrenia, here's your homework. If you have homework. There's a 5-minute video online. Anderson Cooper, the CNN news host, did a schizophrenia simulation where he put in some earbuds that simulated voices in his head. And he's a Mensa Society genius. And he can't even make a paper hat. And he can't remember simple words or numbers or... And then he has to go down on the street and try to buy a newspaper with those voices in his head, and it gets worse. And he says, I just feel like I want to talk to him. I want to answer back. Well, when you see the guy, there was a guy in Terrell that used to walk the median of Main Street. And he would just walk, he's just talking to himself the whole time. And the police let him be because he never got in the way of anything. He just walked up and down this median all day, talking to himself. Well, I asked the police officer and said, yeah, he's been in the hospital 9 or 10 times, and he really doesn't hurt anybody, he doesn't hurt himself, but obviously he has schizophrenia. So anybody that does have that, it's a debilitating thing. It's a horrible disease. But just know, in prevalence, it just barely makes the top 10. Usually comes on in the late teens and early 20s. The hallucinations are usually auditory. So they're usually voices, not exclusively. There are visual hallucinations, kinesthetic, where they feel things that aren't there, smell things that aren't there. So it can be very complicated when you're a psychiatrist trying to deal with somebody who has schizophrenia, who has been living under the bridge for 3 years, so they haven't been to the optometrist, they haven't been to the doctor, they haven't been to the dentist, so they've got these co-occurring medical conditions along with schizophrenia, and we spent 6 months trying a medication regimen that just didn't work for that person. We have to start over, so they got to get recommitted, and it's the whole thing. And it's nobody's fault, really. It's just the way it is, because your brain chemistry doesn't change overnight. It takes a long time. And I'm an ordained minister, so this is just my completely unofficial opinion. Take it for what it's worth. But of all the mental illness, and I'll tell you, church folks are some of the worst when it comes to helping with mental illness. I got some amens, didn't I? Because they want to over-spiritualize everything. Everything's a demonic possession. Everything's this or that. It's not. It's not. It might, but it's probably not. But in schizophrenia, when it's auditory, they're mostly negative. The voices aren't saying, go bake Wayman an apple pie. The voices are saying, Wayman's looking at me, and he better not look at me, or I'm going to XYZ to Wayman. Why is it always negative? Might be something spiritual. Just, a little bit of a shade of it in there. But, yeah, church folks, we got a long way to go to catch up with the rest of the gang in terms of understanding and appreciating mental illnesses. Psychosis, just a little asterisk here. Psychosis is a symptom, not an illness. And examples are delusions, not hallucinations. Because a hallucination is I see something that's not there. I see my dead grandmother walking down the aisle. That's a hallucination. He tried to say. A delusion is when you think you're something you're not. I'm Superman, I have superpowers, I can fly, so I'm going to put on my cape and jump off this building. And I go splat. Because I'm not. So it can include paranoid delusions, disorganized thoughts and behaviors. Almost any of the other mental illnesses, top 10 and beyond, can be accompanied by psychosis. So if you listen, it'll say da-da-da-da-da-da with psychosis. That's why they add that on with a with. We have to mention Alzheimer's and dementia for a minute. It's not a mental illness, but it is a condition of the brain, and more than 7 million people have it. If you've had somebody in your family suffer from dementia, wow. It is a horrific disease. And I think there's some really interesting numbers pertaining to dementia. 12% of the 65 plus population have dementia. But look at the jump from 65 to 75. It goes up to 73%. So that's the time between 65 and 75 to be keeping an eye on mom and dad and grandma and grandpa. And when they start to slip, you got to be brave enough to have those conversations. I cannot tell you how glad I was it was my younger sister who had to take the keys away from my mom. Whew! I wasn't even in the same area code when that happened. Interestingly, and I don't know why, I would love to see some studies on this right here. Hispanic, our brown population over 65 is 1.5 times more likely to have dementia, and our black community twice as likely. Don't know why that is. I really would like to see some people some really smart people put in the work. So here's some random, not so random things to think about that has to do with the stigma. Barely more than half of adults with a mental illness will self-report eventually. The stigma is just still too much, right? And that's one of the big things that we have to break, the myth busters. We have to help continue to break those down and educate people and help people understand that it's okay. Because that's a sad statistic, isn't it? Now, women are 70% more likely to seek treatment. Now, that's interesting because you women are more social with each other. You have a tighter personal social network, and you're more likely to be encouraged by each other, that honey, I'll go with you, I'll hold your hand, etc., etc. Men are just completely closed off. Okay? We're too headstrong, we're too selfish and self-centered to admit that we might have a problem. So we just won't go. I mean, I can play 18 holes of golf with a guy who's going through a divorce, and I get home and my wife say, well, how's Jeff doing? Hey, he's okay. Well, how's Jeff and Molly doing? I don't know. I just spent 3 hours with the guy on the golf course with a lot of peace and quiet. I don't. Why would you not ask about? Because he didn't bring it up, right? 55% of adults, 45% only of parents will seek treatment for their own children. Less, 10% less. Does that not break your heart? That's just a gut punch right there to me. You got these children that are suffering from a disease they don't know nothing about, didn't ask for, and have no idea how to cope. And their parents are more likely to ask for help for themselves than they are for them. All right, test time. You have your homework assignment. Test time. What is the average time delay from the onset of symptoms to the seeking of treatment?
11 years.
Ding, 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 we have a winner. You know. That is egregious. And lots of other words that I can't say in mixed company. 11 years. The average, by the way, if a cancer patient waited 11 weeks, they might be dead. So here's some prevailing myths, and this is the Mythbusters portion of the program. That the mentally ill are dangerous. Are they dangerous? Sometimes, sure. However, they're significantly more likely to be a victim of a violent crime than a perpetrator. Significantly, it's not even close, to tell you the truth. Myth number 2, the mentally ill are criminals. Are they? Some of them, just like some of everybody, are criminals. Youth are 9% less likely to be a criminal. Adults are 20% less likely with a mental illness to be a criminal than the average person without a mental illness. Myth number 3, it's a character flaw. Well, we all know that ain't true. It's hereditary and brain chemistry. And why some people get unlucky and others don't, I don't know. I'm not nearly that smart to be able to figure anything like that out. I just keep chugging and trying to do my little part in my little part of the world, my little beautiful part of northern Smith County in Lindale, Texas. But I can bust these myths within my own family. Thankfully, I work for a faith-based nonprofit that's a helping organization, so I don't have to deal with that a lot of work. But you may have to deal with that a lot at work. And so you can bust those myths. Here's some other key facts. These aren't myths, these are truisms. About 50% of homeless are mentally ill. Just like addictions, who wants to be homeless? Who wants to wake up one day and go, you know, I think I'd like to live under the bridge. I think I'd like to have to scavenge into garbage cans for my food. Yeah, that'd be a good choice for me. Now, why the other half are homeless is complicated. It's not my bailiwick, it's not my area of expertise, but I do know that 50% of the homeless are mentally ill. And Larry, if that's you calling me, you better hang up, because my back pocket's wiggling. So if I start to do an Elvis, y'all forgive me. 37% of state and federal prison inmates have a mental illness, and 44% of city and county jail inmates. Why do you think there are less in the state and federal system than there are at the city-county level?
Because our county jails have become the mental health hospitals.
County jail become the mental health hospital. True. True. It comes down to access. Right? It comes down to access and money. So at the end of the day, state and federal prisons provide more than the city and county jails. And again, the county jail, as in our case, they didn't wake up one day and go, this is what we want to be. They don't want to be that. So it's one of those things that it is what it is, and we have to work through that. And that's one of those things like the Titanic's not going to change overnight. But the culture is changing, and it has changed. If you've been around long enough, you've seen some significant changes. Jail diversion program that only like a handful of other counties in the state have. Mental illness is the leading cause of death by suicide by inmates. Only 45% of inmates with mental illness ever receive treatment. Both my parents worked for the prison system, so I kind of look for statistics that have to do with mental illness related to the prison system. 3 in 5 people with a mental illness who don't get treatment wind up in jail. 3 in 5. Some still wind up in jail, but 3 in 5 who don't get it will wind up in jail. Other key facts. 70% of the kids in juvie are mentally ill. That's sad, but it's not a shock to us, is it? Youth in detention are 10 times more likely than their peers to have a mental illness. In a 6-year span from 2015 to 2020, 1 out of every 4 people in the U.S. who were shot and killed by law enforcement had a history of mental illness. Now that's not being a Monday morning quarterback. That's just saying the community awareness. You know, these officers are put in an impossible situation sometimes to have to defend themselves and the people around them. And it just comes out after the fact that 1 out of every 4 had a mental illness. What about the other 3? Well, some of them were just bad people that were trying to actually hurt other people. Some might have been intellectually disabled or on the autism spectrum and just didn't quite understand the commands that was being given to them by the officer. 1 out of every 8 emergency room visits for mental health or substance-induced mental health issues. 1 in 8 ER visits are for this. And again, Dr. Schnell will have the last session at the end of the day, and he will go into much more detail on that. Mental illness costs the American economy more than $1 trillion. That's 1,000 billion. That's a lot of money. And that's just the American economy. 1,000 billions. Started to try to do an Austin Powers impersonation there, but I tried it in the mirror this morning and the judges said, no. According to Health Resources Service Administration, 40% of all Americans, that's about 150 folks, live in areas that have limited numbers of mental health professionals, where access to mental health and substance abuse treatment is limited or non-existent altogether. 40%. That's a lot of folks. Texas rural population, about 3 million people, which is larger than 18 other states. 74 of our 254 glorious counties don't have a hospital. Isn't that hard to imagine? I know there's West Texas and the Panhandle and all that. 32 counties don't even have a PCP. So how are folks supposed to get help for themselves or help for their kids? Folks are just trying to make it, you know. And mental illness cuts across the economic genres too. Don't think for a minute that the white collar suffer less than the blue collar. They don't. Maybe I should add a statistic about that in my next presentation. Because the white collar hides it better, and they have better access to insurance and have better access to the resources to get help for themselves and their kids on the QT, rather than somebody that's just an hourly wage worker at McDonald's and they have a kid that's showing the early signs of ADHD, and they got a girl that's showing signs of borderline personality disorder already. She's a single mom, trying to do good, and her kid's just got the wheel of misfortune in terms of their brain chemistry. So here's just a bit about IDD, intellectual developmental disability. More than 7 million people nationwide have IDD. 1 out of every 100 people in Smith County. That's some rough, what I call sports math. You know, I'm not good at math until it comes to batting averages or touchdowns or things like that. And I just did some quick mental sports math and came up with 1 in about every 100 people in Smith County. So you law enforcement officers, you're going to have to deal with that eventually if you haven't. Right? You're going to come along and somebody is not going to understand through no fault of their own. They're not going to understand what you're trying to tell them. They're not going to understand that you're actually trying to help them. And then you add people that are on the autism spectrum, 5 million plus, which that skews male. Boys are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed than girls. And so for every 100 mental health calls in Smith County, there will be 2 to 3 cases of autism. And one of the primary features of autism is they have impaired social cognition and lack of understanding of communication. And they don't have the ability to process and to communicate back that they understand. They just see the world. They're on a whole different script than we are. So as we kind of finish up these next few minutes, in Smith County, I kind of taken a poll. I'm really proud of 2 things that I've done. Of all the things I've done in my career, 2 things. The Crisis Intervention Training class, which is a 40-hour police officer class, or class for police officers that have to take it every year. And then a 40-hour mental health peace officer class that is an elective that officers can take to become a mental health deputy or a mental health officer. I took both of those classes as a civilian. Took 2 weeks of my vacation and paid my own way and got looked at funny for 2 weeks. Who is this guy? He's a narc for sure. But as I've talked to these mental health officers and deputies, about half of the mental health related calls are for people who were previously on meds but are off of them. The recidivism rate is even worse nationwide, so Texas is winning, yay! Nationwide it's 54%, that's horrible. And that's a post, you know, on the sequential intercept map, that's like the last part, right? the community service part, the long-term care, making sure they have access to their meds, making sure that they have, the money to get the meds, the transportation to get the meds, et cetera, et cetera. Why do people who are on mental health meds get off of them? Primary reason why. They start to feel better. And they have a huge blind spot where they don't quite understand that they're sick. There's an official word for that I can't remember, but there is a word for that. That they are very sick, but they just have no clue that that is the case for them. So here are some thoughtful solutions. And you can come up with your own, but I came up with 5 just to give us some food for thought. 1, Texas is at or near the bottom of nearly every spending metric for mental health issues. I never thought I'd hear those words. Texas is last? We ain't last in nothing. Apparently we are. Alabama, Louisiana, and other such states are ahead of us in spending per capita. And that's embarrassing, quite frankly. And I'm not even a native Texan. Probably shouldn't have told y'all that. Another idea is involvement at every level of government, from the national all the way down to state, county, city, school boards, civic clubs, and churches. Talked about the faith-based community a while ago. If you're a deacon or an elder or have a position of influence or authority in the church, it's incumbent upon you to educate your peers on the truth and to bust the myths that exist about mental illness. Can I get an amen for that?
Amen.
If you're a Little League coach, if you're a Boy Scout or Girl Scout leader, they still have Girl Scouts? Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts? If you're on the school board, if you're on whatever, if you're on the water board. Let's edit that one out too. Okay? We need to get involved. And where, the old phrase, bloom where you're planted. Just bloom where you're planted. And be a beacon of light and hope and help people understand some of these things that we're talking about. And insist on normalization of mental health issues. It's always on the fringe. It's the elephant in the room that everybody knows is there, but nobody wants to talk about. And I find it fascinating that we will talk in the zeitgeist of that's staying in right there. In the zeitgeist of, you can look it up later, of the American conversation, we will talk about anything, even up to and including gender issues, right? What makes mental illness so hard to talk about when we're talking about everything else? Everything. There's not one thing I can think about that we don't talk about in the public forum. And thank God for some of these athletes and entertainers who are coming forward and saying, hey, I'm Michael Phelps. I suffer from manic depression for years, but I won 1 billion gold medals. I'm the most successful Olympian ever in the history of the Olympics. And I have manic depression and I still take meds for that every day. We need more people to do that. And we just keep pushing the ball down the field. 2 yards, a cloud of dust. 2 yards, a cloud of dust. There's not going to be any Hail Marys. There's not going to be any big touchdown-saving plays. Now, this year in the legislature in Texas, that we had that overabundance of money, that's a nice chunk play. But that's like a once-in-a-lifetime thing. We probably won't see that again in our entire life. That kind of abundance and being able to use it for things. I still wish I worked at Terrell State Hospital. They got a 40% pay raise. I'd be making 6 figures. Me! I didn't graduate 9th in a class of 9, though. I was like 7th or 8th. So through a recent initiative, public school employees and public and private higher ed institutions in Texas can get free mental health first aid training through their local mental health authority, which is, of course, the Andrews Center. And they did a wonderful job organizing and hosting this event. But if you're associated with a school, a public school, or a public or private higher ed institution, we want to bring an an instructor in mental health first aid. We want to bring that to you for free. Okay, it's a 1 or 2 day class, depending on which class you take. And it's a general awareness for teachers and professors and colleagues to help identify their friends and their family who are in the early stages of mental illness to catch it before it gets too late, right? So personal story part 2. As I finish up, I got 6 minutes. My mom had me. Sometimes she thinks she hatched me. She actually fell down a flight of stairs and went into labor with me. So that's pretty much all you need to know about me. But 5 years, I got 5 really good years with her. Single, stay-at-home mom. My dad was a mechanic, so he didn't make much, but you know, back in the 60s, you didn't need much. So I had this little apartment, and she stayed home with me, just loved on me for 5 years. Then my sister was born, and she got postpartum depression, which affects 11% of all women. More than 1 in 10. And postpartum depression for a short period of time can be even worse than clinical depression. And it can affect the spouse as well. The worse my mom got, the worse my dad got. The worse my mom got, the more dad drank, the more he stayed away because he didn't know how to cope, right? He wasn't equipped to deal with a wife who was having this postpartum depression that developed into what we now know as bipolar 2. Right? The ups and the downs and the ups and the downs. But the better she got after 11 years, by the way, was her timeline. I always think that's ironic. It took her 11 years. So about the time I got my driver's license, she started to get the help she needed. She became a paramedic. My dad became an EMT. They got to work on the ambulance together, if you can believe it. She became a nurse and then a psych nurse, and she helped open the very first max security prison in Texas, completely dedicated to psychiatric inmates. Chester Unit 4. That deserves an applause. That's for Linda. Down in Sugar Land, Texas. And Texas yet is last. Leaving thousands and thousands of Lindas on the fringe, suffering in small towns where there's no access to anything. They might not have a hospital, they might not have even a primary care doctor. So, today is about building bridges across the aisle. Empathy is the art of stepping imaginatively. You all wouldn't be the success that you are in your jobs, even you police, if you didn't have some imagination. But sometimes certain jobs squeeze the imagination out of you. Step imaginatively into the shoes of another, understanding their feelings and perspective and using that understanding to guide your actions. I found this from an Australian philosopher who I'd never heard of before, whose name I can't pronounce. But it's a good quote, isn't it? So, if you have any questions, please hold them.